Picture the scene. An official, the EPA administrator, stands at a polished podium, a confident smile playing on his lips. He's announcing what he calls the end of 16 years of uncertainty, a move to rescue American families from what he claims are billions in hidden taxes. He's practically giddy, framing the reversal of a key climate finding as a long-awaited victory, a triumph of common sense over twisted law and warped science. It's a performance of absolute certainty. But then, almost at the same time, another story begins to unfold, not with a triumphant press conference, but with the quiet release of a lengthy, data-filled report. The National Academies of Sciences, the country's most distinguished scientific body, has something to say, and their conclusion is the polar opposite. They state with no ambiguity that the original finding was not only accurate, but is now reinforced by even stronger evidence. It's an unflinching, direct contradiction. So you have this jarring split-screen moment. On one side, a powerful official declaring victory over a phantom threat. On the other, the nation's top scientists calmly stating that the threat is more real and more dangerous than ever before. It's a conflict that feels almost ancient, like a modern-day echo of a famous astronomer forced to deny that the Earth moves, muttering under his breath. And yet it moves.
It really is. It's quite a moment, isn't it? Because you're seeing this direct, very high-stakes clash between, let's say, political judgment and, well, rigorously established scientific consensus. The implications here are huge, potentially reshaping regulations for, years.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we want to do today. Unpack this direct contradiction for you. We're going deep into the specific legal foundation that's being challenged here, the frankly wildly different standards of science being used to back up these opposing views, and maybe most importantly, the bigger societal picture, what this fight over established science really means for all of us.
Yeah, looking at how science gets sort of pulled into the political arena, either as a tool or something that needs protecting by these objective research institutions.
Okay, so before we really dig into how they're trying to take this apart, maybe we should quickly lay out the foundation itself, this endangerment finding. It's basically the bedrock for almost all federal climate action, right? For anyone listening who isn't familiar, what exactly is it and why does it legally matter so much?
Right. So the endangerment finding, it's this formal conclusion that EPA reached back in 2009. It's both scientific and legal. Essentially, it says that greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs, from things like cars and trucks, are contributing to air pollution, and critically, that this pollution can be reasonably expected to endanger public health and public welfare.
Okay.
And the key thing is, once the EPA makes that finding, it actually triggers their responsibility under the Clean Air Act to regulate those emissions. So no finding, no legal basis for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. It's that fundamental.
And this wasn't just the EPA deciding this on its own, right? This came from higher up.
Yeah.
From the Supreme Court.
Exactly. It wasn't arbitrary. It was directly mandated because of the Supreme Court's 2007 decision in Massachusetts v. EPA. That case really was the turning point.
How so?
Well, the Supreme Court ruled, it was a 5-4 decision, that greenhouse gases clearly fit the definition of an air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. Before that, the EPA had argued it didn't really have the authority or maybe the obligation to regulate them for climate purposes. But the court said, nope, they are air pollutants under the law. And the Clean Air Act says the EPA has to regulate any air pollutant that causes or contributes to air pollution, which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. So the court basically told the EPA, figure out if GHGs pose a danger.
So the EPA did its homework, came back in 2009 and said, yes, they do pose a danger, both to public health, things like breathing problems from heat and bad air quality.
Right, heat stress, respiratory issues.
And also public welfare, meaning impacts on farming, water, bigger storms, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Agriculture, water resources, coastal areas due to sea level rise, extreme weather events, the whole range of impacts. And once that finding was finalized in 2009, that became the legal justification for all sorts of rules that followed vehicle emission standards, the Clean Power Plan for power plants, methane regulations for oil and gas.
Got it. So really solidified the Clean Air Act as the main tool the U.S. has been using for climate policy.
Precisely. So now let's fast forward to this attempt to revoke it, the administration's proposal. While the sources we've looked at describe it as relying on what critics are calling, misinterpretations of the law and fringe science, it's really a multi-pronged legal attack.
Okay, let's break those down. These novel legal claims, as they're called. What's the first big challenge they're making to the EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act, specifically Section 202A?
The first one is maybe the boldest. They're essentially trying to redefine what air pollution even means in the context of this part of the Act. The proposal argues the term should be read very narrowly to only include pollutants that cause harm through, quote, local or regional exposure. So by that logic, pollutants that cause global harm, like CO2, wouldn't count under this specific section, effectively cutting off the EPA's authority to regulate them here.
Wait a second. If the Supreme Court already said in 2007 that GHGs are air pollutants and told the EPA to assess their danger, which is obviously a global issue, how can they legally argue for this narrow, local-only interpretation now? Doesn't that fly right in the face of the Mass v. EPA ruling?
Well, that's exactly what critics argue. It looks like a direct attempt to relitigate something the Supreme Court seemed to settle. Their argument hinges on the nature of the harm, global versus local, dictating the EPA's authority. It's a distinction the Supreme Court didn't make back then. They're basically trying to card climate change out of the definition of air pollution for this purpose, despite the precedent.
Okay, that's ambitious.
Yeah.
What's a second big legal argument they're using? It involves a more recent Supreme Court case, right? West Virginia v. EPA from 2022.
Yes, this one's quite strategic, or, as critics might say, a strategic misuse of precedent. West Virginia v. EPA did put some limits on the EPA, specifically about how it could regulate power plant emissions. It invoked something called the major questions doctrine, saying Congress needs to speak really clearly if an agency is going to make huge, transformative regulatory changes.
Right, it was about the method the EPA wanted to use for power plants, not about whether GHGs were pollutants.
Exactly. The West Virginia ruling actually sort of acknowledged the EPA's general authority to regulate GHGs under the Clean Air Act. It just put guardrails on how far the agency could push certain regulatory schemes without very explicit permission from Congress.
So how is the revocation proposal using that?
It's trying to take that ruling, which was about a specific regulatory method for one sector, and blow it up into a much bigger constraint. They're arguing that West Virginia now imposes this super high major question bar for regulating GHGs in general across the board, not just for power plants in that specific way. Legal analysts see this as a significant overreach, trying to turn a restriction on method into a restriction on the fundamental authority itself.
Okay. And there's a third legal claim, something about the endangerment finding itself.
Correct. This one attacks the process. The proposal suggests the EPA shouldn't be allowed to issue an endangerment finding as a standalone scientific determination. Instead, it should only be able to make such a finding at the same time it issues specific emissions standards.
Why would that matter?
It would completely gum up the works. An endangerment finding is meant to be the scientific foundation this pollutant is dangerous, period. Then the agency can build different regulations on top of that foundation for different sources, like cars, power plants, etc. If the EPA had to redo the entire endangerment, finding all the science, all the legal justification, every single time it wanted to regulate a new source category, well, it would be incredibly inefficient, maybe even impossible. It would create this paralyzing bureaucratic loop.
So, attack the definition of pollution, raise the bar for regulation using West Virginia, and make the finding process itself unworkable. That covers the legal side. But they also challenge the science underpinning the 2009 finding, right? Even if the EPA has the authority, they argue it was used unreasonably back then. What's that about?
Right. This is where they bring in what many scientists consider fringe arguments. The proponent claims the EPA acted unreasonably in 2009 because it supposedly didn't consider the potential benefits of more greenhouse gases.
Benefits? Like what?
They specifically talk about things like global greening, the idea that more CO2 helps plants grow and maybe increase agricultural output in some areas. They essentially argue that the major scientific consensus reports, like those from the IPCC or the U.S. government's own climate science program, are, quote, unduly pessimistic because they focus too much on the harms and not enough on these disputed benefits.
So they're basically saying decades of global research by thousands of scientists is biased because it doesn't give enough weight to these controversial upsides.
That's the essence of it. It's an attempt to frame the established consensus as incomplete or skewed, thereby creating space to argue that, back in 2009, there wasn't sufficient reliable information to retain the conclusion that GHG emissions cause or contribute to endangerment. It's substituting a contrarian view for the mainstream scientific understanding.
Okay, let's talk concrete impacts.
Yeah.
If this endangerment finding is revoked, what happens immediately? What's the direct regulatory fallout?
The most immediate and explicit consequence outlined in the proposal is the rollback of all greenhouse gas emissions standards for new motor vehicles and engines. That's huge. It covers cars, light trucks, medium-duty, heavy-duty trucks. Basically everything on wheels for model years going all the way back to 2012 and looking forward to 2027 and beyond.
Wow. So the rules pushing for more fuel efficiency, eventually leading towards electric vehicles, gone.
Immediately dismantled. That whole regulatory structure driving vehicle efficiency vanishes.
What about the other big sectors? Power plants, oil and gas operations. The proposal doesn't directly repeal those rules, does it?
Not directly in this specific proposal, no. But the legal domino effect is clear and, frankly, inevitable. The 2009 endangerment finding was the legal bedrock those other rules were built upon. If you remove the foundation, the structures built on top of the power plant rules, the methane rules lose their legal basis.
So they have to issue separate rules to repeal those later.
Yes, they'd need separate rulemaking processes to formally repeal them, but it becomes a foregone conclusion. Once the endangerment finding is gone, those other regulations are legally indefensible under the Clean Air Act. The repeal would just be a matter of time and paperwork.
So looking at this whole picture, who wins and who loses if this goes through, the sources we look at seem pretty clear on this.
They do. Analysts point out several losers. First, the American public, facing increased climate impacts, more severe heat waves, worse storms, poor air quality, all hitting vulnerable communities hardest. Second, arguably the U.S. auto industry itself, at least in the long run. Slowing the transition to EVs makes it harder for U.S. companies to compete globally, especially against places like China that are moving much faster on electrification.
And the winner.
The clear winner identified by critics is the fossil fuel industry. This move is often characterized as a direct effort to prop up the industry, delay the energy transition, and keep the current energy system profitable for as long as possible, even at the expense of long-term climate stability and public health. Some sources explicitly called it an attempt to bail out the fossil fuel industry by gaslighting Americans about climate change.
Okay, this brings us right back to that split-screen moment we started with, the political action trying to revoke the finding and the scientific counter-response. To justify this revocation, the EPA leaned heavily on a report from the Department of Energy, the DOE. What was the main argument in that DOE report?
Yeah, the DOE report was clearly intended to provide the scientific justification, or maybe cover, for the EPA's proposal. Its main thrust was to directly challenge the established scientific consensus on climate change harms. It pushed this idea that rising CO2 levels will lead to significant global greening, more plant growth, and suggested these supposed benefits could outweigh the known harms of warming.
Trying to create doubt about the net negative impact.
Precisely. To create just enough scientific ambiguity, or the appearance of it, to make revoking the endangerment finding seem reasonable, or at least debatable on scientific grounds.
But the way this DOE report was created, and who wrote it, came under intense criticism, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the concerns there?
Huge concerns. The main criticisms focus on its lack of transparency and independence. First, it was drafted by a very small group, just 5 scientists. And these weren't just any scientists. They were individuals already well known for being skeptical of mainstream climate science, people like John Christie, Judith Curry, Stephen Koonin.
So not exactly a broad representation of the field.
Not at all. And second, the process was opaque. It was initially drafted without any public comment period, which is standard practice for federal reports meant to guide major policy decisions. Furthermore, some mainstream scientists whose work was cited in the report later came out saying the DOE had misused or cherry-picked their findings to fit a predetermined narrative.
Okay, so that's the DOE report. Now let's put it side by side with the report released almost simultaneously by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, NASEM. This is generally seen as the top scientific advisory body in the country. What did NASEM conclude about that original 2009 endangerment finding?
NASEM's conclusion couldn't have been clearer or more different from the DOE's. They stated completely unambiguously that the 2009 finding, the one saying human-caused emissions threaten health and welfare, wasn't just accurate back then, but is now, quote, reinforced by even stronger evidence after another 16 years of research and observation.
So the exact opposite conclusion.
The exact opposite. NASEM found that multiple lines of evidence looking at everything from observational data on extreme weather and rising sea levels to heat-related health impacts all point to the fact that greenhouse gas emissions are still the main driver of the long-term warming trend we're seeing.
And the process NASEM uses is often called the gold standard for building scientific consensus. How did their approach differ so starkly from the DOE's small group of skeptics?
The difference is all about process and institutional integrity. First, NASEM funded its report independently. That shields it from immediate political pressures right from the start. Second, they actively sought public input before they even started drafting, gathering perspectives from over 200 individuals and organizations across the spectrum.
And the committee writing the report itself, was it also a small, hand-picked group?
No, quite the opposite. The NASEM committee had 16 members, chosen specifically for diverse expertise. You had top academics, scientists from government labs, but also, importantly, people with backgrounds linked to potentially affected industries. For instance, there was a former Chevron fellow on the committee and an engineer who had consulted for oil and gas companies.
Why include them?
Because that's key to NASEM's credibility. They deliberately include varied perspectives to ensure a balanced assessment, and their conflict of interest rules are incredibly strict. All authors and reviewers have to disclose any relevant financial ties, like investments in fossil fuels, or past advisory roles that could potentially bias their judgment.
So unlike the DOE report's small group, known skeptics, done quietly, NASEM had independence, public input, diverse expertise, mandatory disclosure, and what else?
Exhaustive external review. The draft report was then sent out for peer review by 15 additional outside experts. The whole NASEM process is designed around objectivity and open-mindedness. The committee's job is to rigorously weigh all the evidence, especially the observational data gathered since 2009, and rely on multiple independent sources to reach a consensus finding.
It's important we touch on this. The administration's proposal to revoke the finding actually criticized established reports, like the IPCC's, saying they didn't meet some internal standard called gold science. What even was that standard?
Yeah, that phrase gold science, it wasn't, a recognized scientific benchmark. It appears to have been a kind of subjective internal label the administration created. It seemed to demand levels of certainty that are often unrealistic in complex systems like climate, and it allowed them to dismiss major consensus reports as unduly pessimistic.
So basically a rhetorical tool.
Essentially, yes. A way to reject the findings of established bodies like the IPCC and the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which then conveniently cleared the path to accept the much narrower contrarian DOE report instead.
Predictably, this direct contradiction between NASEM and the administration's move sparked immediate reactions, both political and legal. How did politicians respond to NASEM stepping in?
Well, you saw pushback. For example, House Oversight Chair James Comer reportedly called the NASEM report a blatant partisan act to undermine the Trump administration. That reaction really represents the view that any independent scientific assessment that contradicts a desired policy outcome must be politically motivated, regardless of the scientific rigor behind it.
And what about the courts? How did they view the DOE's secretive process for creating its report?
The courts came down pretty hard on the DOE. A federal judge specifically rebuked the department for its lack of transparency. The ruling found that the DOE report was essentially created in secret, violating the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. FACA requires transparency when advisory groups are formed to influence federal policy.
What was the DOE's defense?
They tried to argue the report was just a simple review of existing literature, not formal advice, and therefore exempt from FACA's transparency rules. But the judge wasn't buying it. The judge stated that calling it a mere review borders on sophistry, and that the report's language and clear intent showed it was providing advice or recommendations for a renewed approach to climate policy.
So the court basically said it was an opaque attempt to cook up a policy recommendation under the guise of a literature review.
That's the gist of the ruling, yes.
But we should also acknowledge the counter-arguments, like the one from the Cato Institute about NASEM's role here. What was their criticism?
Their critique centered on NASEM's congressional charter. Cato argued that NASEM might have overstepped by issuing this report without being formally requested by Congress or the executive branch, potentially violating its charter, which says it should report whenever called upon. From this perspective, the endangerment finding isn't purely scientific. It involves the EPA administrator's judgment about whether endangerment can be reasonably anticipated. Therefore, it's partly a policy decision. By weighing in so strongly, Cato argued, NASEM was improperly inserting itself into a political or policy debate, rather than sticking strictly to science when asked.
This whole situation, the coordinated effort to push fringe science, the criticism of established bodies like NASEM, it really seems to point to a much bigger issue within federal science, doesn't it? This idea of systemic political interference trying to control or suppress climate research findings.
I think that's a fair assessment based on the evidence. We're not just talking about isolated incidents here. There was a major study looking at this, surveying federal scientists over 5 years across 7 different agencies. It found 150 scientists reported experiencing at least 435 instances of political interference. That suggests it's a pretty widespread systemic problem.
And the ways this interference happens can be quite blatant, designed to stop information from getting out.
Absolutely. Some of the specific examples documented are quite concerning. For instance, a NASA press release about climate change impacts in Antarctica. The findings were significantly watered down by political press officers. They changed the language so much that the key scientific conclusions were basically made to sound unimportant, unnewsworthy.
So the public never hears the real findings.
Or they hear a distorted version. Another example. A NOAA scientist had important research on ocean warming ready to go. The planned press conference to announce it was downgraded, then downgraded again, and eventually just canceled altogether. It effectively prevents timely, critical climate information from reaching the public and policymakers.
And it goes beyond just editing press releases, right? There are instances of scientists being directly monitored.
Yes, that was reported too. Cases where scientists were told they could only do interviews if a political appointee, essentially a minder, was present during the conversation, presumably to control the message. And even more directly, there was an instance where political appointees at the Office of Management and Budget actually altered scientific documents prepared by NOAA scientists before they went to Congress, specifically misrepresenting the climate science involved.
It sounds like these efforts follow a pattern. There's this concept called the disinformation playbook that describes tactics used by industries and political actors to undermine science and delay regulations. Does that apply here?
It seems highly applicable. The playbook outlines 5 core tactics that have been used repeatedly across different issues, not just climate, but also things like lead poisoning, tobacco risks, sugar, even endangered species. The goal is always the same. Sow doubt, distort the science, harass the messengers, and ultimately delay policies that might hurt profits or challenge political agendas.
Okay, let's maybe walk through those 5 tactics briefly, because they really illuminate what's happening. The first one is faking science. What does that entail?
This is about actively creating biased research. It could involve funding studies designed to reach a specific conclusion, hiding conflicts of interest, or paying others to produce flawed work. The aim isn't discovering truth, it's manufacturing evidence to support a desired outcome. Like, studies funded by industry are known to be far more likely to find results favorable to the sponsor.
Any examples?
A classic historical example involves Johnson & Johnson and their talcum powder. Sources indicate they knew internally about asbestos contamination as early as 1971, but failed to report numerous independent tests confirming it and actively massaged the findings they did send to the FDA. By controlling the scientific information flow, they delayed regulatory action for decades.
Okay, the second tactic, manufacturing uncertainty. This isn't faking data, but spinning existing doubt.
Exactly. Science always has uncertainty. This tactic exploits that. It uses PR, lobbying, and media campaigns to amplify normal scientific debate or focus on tiny uncertainties, blowing them out of proportion to create public doubt about the overall consensus. The indoor tanning industry did this effectively. Despite strong evidence linking UV tanning beds to skin cancer, they relentlessly pushed messages about vitamin D, questioned the melanoma link, and even got the CDC to soften warnings. The subtext is always, if scientists aren't 100% certain, why should we act?
Right. Number 3 is harassing scientists. This sounds more personal.
It is. This involves attacking the researchers themselves, trying to damage their credibility or intimidate them into silence. This can range from spreading baseless accusations of misconduct, threatening their jobs, or burying them in burdensome public records requests designed just to disrupt their work.
Like the Monsanto example.
Precisely. When the WHO's cancer agency, IARC, classified the herbicide glyphosate as a probable carcinogen, Monsanto reportedly launched a campaign to discredit IARC and its scientists, using things like open records requests and even working with politicians to threaten IARC's funding. It's about undermining the messenger when you can't refute the message.
Okay, tactic 4, buying credibility. How does that work?
This is about using the reputation of legitimate institutions to mask or legitimize questionable activities. Industries might fund university programs, endow chairs, or create research centers that subtly advance their agenda under the banner of academic credibility. Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, did this by funding a pain program at Mass General Hospital. Internal documents later revealed a key goal was gaining name recognition and political protection to counter efforts addressing the opioid crisis, essentially buying access and legitimacy while their product fueled the epidemic.
And the fifth tactic, manipulating officials. This targets the regulatory process directly.
Yes, this involves using financial clout, lobbying, exploiting loopholes, or the classic revolving door, hiring former regulators to lobby their old agencies, or placing former industry insiders into key government positions. A documented example is from 2009 when the tobacco and e-cigarette industry successfully lobbied against FDA efforts to ban flavored e-cigarettes. A key lobbyist was a former White House budget analyst, and after numerous meetings, the White House ultimately blocked the flavor ban, showing how insider access and influence can directly override public health goals.
When you see these tactics deployed, alongside the documented interference within federal agencies, the overall impact must be really damaging, not just for policy, but for the scientists themselves.
The costs are definitely high on multiple levels. Research looking at ecologists and conservation scientists found that this kind of suppression directly leads to problems like inadequate public debate. About 45% of those surveyed felt that happened, and policymakers being poorly informed, which 25% cited. Government scientists, in particular, reported more often that policies were not being informed by the relevant science.
And what about the personal impact on these scientists?
It's significant. The survey showed about a third of respondents reported personal suffering, things like job loss, mental health struggles directly linked to suppression efforts. And over half, 56% of government scientists said their job satisfaction was compromised because of these external constraints on their work. It creates this chilling effect, and it erodes public trust because people start wondering if they can believe any science coming out of government if it might be politically filtered.
Who is actually applying the pressure? Where does it come from within the organizations?
The data is pretty clear, especially for government employees. They overwhelmingly point to senior management, 82% cited them. Workplace policy itself was cited by 72%, and the minister's office, or equivalent high political levels, by 63%. It really highlights that this is often a top-down control mechanism within government agencies.
Is it different outside government?
Interestingly, yes. University and industry scientists who reported self-censoring often did so for different reasons, primarily fear of being misrepresented by the media or lack of confidence in their public communication skills. It suggests a different dynamic compared to the direct institutional constraints felt by government scientists.
It's really striking how, when powerful interests want to push back against established science, especially on climate, they often reach for history to make their case. And the figure of Galileo Galilei comes up again and again. It's like a modern-day Inquisition narrative they construct.
It's a very deliberate and, frankly, quite potent rhetorical strategy. They frame themselves, the climate skeptics or contrarians, as being like Galileo, the lone, brave, rational scientist standing up against a powerful, dogmatic authority.
And who plays the role of the dogmatic authority, the church, in this modern retelling?
In their narrative, that role is cast onto the scientific establishment, particularly bodies like the IPCC, major research universities, and any political institutions that accept and act on the climate consensus. They label this establishment the climate church, or describe it as an authoritarian force driven by religious beliefs.
The language is incredibly dramatic, hunt for dissidents, history repeating itself. It's designed to evoke a sense of persecution, right?
Absolutely. It does two things very effectively. First, it elevates their own, often fringe position into a heroic struggle for truth against oppression. Second, it simultaneously tries to delegitimize the vast body of scientific consensus by portraying it not as evidence-based findings, but as rigid dogma or unquestionable political faith.
And this narrative often connects to the idea of common sense, doesn't it? If the establishment is just being dogmatic, then maybe simple, everyday logic is the real truth.
Exactly. Common sense becomes the weapon against complexity. You hear arguments like, we don't have a climate crisis, we have a crisis in common sense and honesty. This cleverly reframes the rejection of complex climate science, which often requires specialized understanding as the natural, obvious position for any clear-thinking person. It dismisses expertise in favor of intuition.
You can see how that would resonate, especially in places that value secularism or democracy highly.
It's particularly effective there. In countries like Sweden, for example, where there's a strong national identity tied to secularism and democracy, opponents can link climate science institutions like the IPCC to this idea of a religious institution. By doing that, they position climate science itself as a threat to those core national values. They'll claim the media or parliament are engaging in censorship because they align with the climate church.
So they use Galileo, a symbol of Western rationality, to actually undermine modern science.
Precisely. It twists the historical symbol to attack the very process of scientific knowledge building today. It fuels this ongoing battle over who gets to define reality, who holds epistemic authority. Is it the scientific experts, or is it common sense and the dissenting individual?
But beneath this whole ideological fight, this battle over history and truth, there seems to be a much more concrete conflict driving it: economic anxiety.
Oh, absolutely. The material conflict is almost always right there, explicitly linked in these narratives. They consistently connect climate action, things like carbon taxes, phasing out fossil fuels, investing in renewables, to economic hardship, job losses, rising living costs, even the dismantling of the welfare state. The message is, climate policy will make you poor.
It becomes a narrative not just of intellectual oppression, but economic oppression too. This fear that it's not really about the planet, but about control.
Exactly that dystopian fear. You see posts expressing concern that the whole climate agenda, the models, the research, it's all just steered by a political desire to create positions of power and control and tax people with an iron fist. Money spent on climate research or mitigation is often portrayed as money taken away from essential public services or welfare. So rejecting climate science becomes framed as a defense of economic well-being.
And what economic system are they implicitly or explicitly defending?
They are defending what analysts call fossil capitalism. The narrative often celebrates fossil fuels as the source of all past prosperity, the thing that saved people from poverty and starvation. Climate action, in contrast, is painted as this dangerous climate religion that will inevitably lead back to poverty and suffering.
So it ignores the downsides or inequalities of the current system.
It tends to champion an extractivist, often unequal economic model built on fossil fuels, while downplaying or ignoring the environmental costs and global injustices that system generates. The Galileo allegory, in this context, serves as a kind of philosophical cover story, a historical justification for resisting change and maintaining the existing structures of economic power tied to fossil fuels. #outro.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what we've really explored is this fundamental contradiction playing out right now in American policy.
Yeah.
You have this clash between rigorous, established scientific consensus backed up by transparent processes like NASEMS, and on the other side, these politically motivated regulatory efforts.
Yeah, efforts that seem to rely on, well, much more opaque processes, fringe science arguments, and these really potent historical allegories like the Galileo story to try and justify rolling back climate action. And all this happens against a backdrop of documented political interference trying to shape the scientific narrative coming from within government itself.
It really goes beyond just one specific rule or regulation, doesn't it? It feels like a fundamental fight over whose version of reality, whose standard for what counts as reliable science, that gold standard idea, gets embedded into law.
Exactly. If these legal maneuvers to revoke the endangerment finding were to succeed, it wouldn't just be one rule change. It would effectively dismantle the main legal tool the U.S. has used to address climate change for over a decade. And the consequences extend beyond just environmental policy, impacting things like American competitiveness in the clean energy race, and ultimately the long-term protection of public health and welfare from climate impacts.
The outcome of this ongoing struggle, this tension between political goals and empirical evidence, truly will shape the foundation of environmental law, and maybe even the public's trust in scientific guidance for many years to come. It raises profound questions about whether our institutions, designed to keep science independent, can actually withstand these kinds of focused political pressures.